Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me today is Eddie Celaya, host of the Here We'd Go podcast and reporter at the Arizona Daily Star. Thank you very much for joining me today, Eddie.
David, so good to be here.
Excellent. It's great to have you. But before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. So, Eddie, I always like to know a little bit about how people got involved with the cannabis industry. So what was it that brought you here?
I guess my first involvement with the cannabis industry was with the black market back when I was about 14, 15 years old. But if we're talking getting into the kind of profession, the industry that is cannabis, it really started back in 2021. I actually was interviewing to be a food writer at the time. And the editor of kind of our arts and life section of the paper during that interview said, "Hey, I mean, do you have any sort of background or experience with cannabis?" And of course, this is during the deep pandemic. So we were doing something similar to this basically for our interview. And my bong was right under my desk. So I was thinking at first, is this some sort of trick from HR to kind of, hey, he's in an interview right now, let's see if we can get him to admit. But that ended up turning in from a food writer interview into a cannabis writer interview. And that's how I initially got to covering the industry here in Arizona.
Okay. I mean, did you have the same background? Because, I mean, it'd be the same flag.
Yeah, it was pretty much me just kind of creating this beat on the go.
Yeah.
I guess luckily enough, that at that point, even if we did take drug tests, it had been legalized in Arizona. So if they did want to look more into my background, it was like, hey, even if it pops up green, that is okay in this state now. That would be part of my cover. That was one of my first stories, was writing about what kind of has changed with what was Prop 207 passing here.
Well, I find that really interesting, because you got to sort of blaze the trail of an entirely new beat. What was that like?
At first, it was really scary. Before then, I had been in the opinions page and I had done breaking news. And those are all kind of like, hey, some news is happening, so you cover it sort of thing. In the cannabis industry, there was news happening. It's just that it wasn't kind of presented to you. I had to go out there and kind of find it. At least initially. Now the industry has really grown here in Arizona, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later. But at first, really finding local stories was a little bit of a mystery. I wasn't sure which bigger or larger cannabis companies were based out of Tucson or Southern Arizona. So a lot of it was still going to dispensaries and just asking questions of bud tenders and some of the general managers and owners of those spots, and kind of networking from there, going to big industry events and just being like, hey, I'm Mr. Reporter and most people were shocked that the legacy newspaper in town, most people are used to our alternative weekly in town covering things, but the legacy newspaper in town, I think people at first were a little like, who is this guy? But I've really ingratiated myself, I think, into the community, and that's where most of my tips and stories come from, are from people here locally who reach out and like, Eddie, you need to be talking about this. So that first few months of really digging and establishing sources has really paid off now, to where 90% of the stuff is people reaching out to me.
Mm. Were people at first apprehensive to talk to the big media?
A little bit, because, and I think a little bit of it was some of the issues I chose to cover at first, along with legalization here in Arizona. there was something called an expungement process, and some states have this and some states don't. And I thought, I mean, hey, it's great that everybody is able to go out and ostensibly get some weed at their local dispensary, but for people who have had charges on their on their record, this is something that's a life-changing event, and that they can expunge. They have the ability to expunge many of these charges. Is just super cool, and I wanted to cover that. And then once you start talking to folks, it's like, oh, like they don't really want their names used because they've they've already been through so odd a long of a time where their name was associated with cannabis, and that was treated kind of like pornography by folks who are looking at credit or looking at housing or looking at jobs. And I did get a little bit of pushback from folks who were like, I think my story is worth telling. I can't really give you my name for it, sort of thing. But most people within the actual industry were more than willing, actually, to come out and speak with me. They really wanted their stories told to, I don't want to say a more mainstream audience, but definitely an audience that had not been exposed to the kind of positives of cannabis and marijuana before.
Is the expungement program working?
Not as it was intended to. If you talk to the advocates, both who are funded by some state dollars and those like NORML, the kind of the usual suspects, they'll tell you that there are, I mean, near in the hundreds of thousands of folks who have small time charges on their records just here in Arizona. And right now, there's only been a few thousand folks who have actually gone through the whole process in this, 2.5 years now. And most of them are up in Maricopa County, which is our largest county, where Phoenix is. And their process of kind of going through that expungement, I guess you will, suite of cases, is really expedited compared to everybody else. There's been some question in the language used when this bill was passed. What's actually required for the person who has the charges on their record? What do they need to produce or procure in some cases about their case? Or to really be justified. Some folks up in Maricopa County, the actual county attorneys are helping actually provide some of the paperwork, because some of these cases from the 70s, 80s, and even the early 90s either has been lost or is hard to find, or in some cases they don't specify, even though it was only an eighth of marijuana that was found on somebody, or some paraphernalia. In some cases, the arresting officer would only write marijuana found and not really have an actual grammage amount or total amount. And some prosecutors see that as, well, hey, like that could mean anything. That could mean, you had like pounds on you. And they really have to find some sort of way to prove that that's not the case. So it has not worked as intended.
No, it's been very frustrating kind of across the board, because you see somebody like President Biden come out and say that everybody is going to get taken care of. And then you realize it's only a handful of people. And even that's not really moving forward.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, what is the process for that expungement through the federal system even?
So along the way, as you're kind of building this career as a beat reporter, when did you start the podcast, and how did that kind of come to fruition? Why'd you do it?
So the podcast kind of came 8 months, 10 months later from when the beat started.
Okay.
And the impetus for the podcast, number one, was it was kind of a meeting of the minds of, hey, I had this idea that, like, hey, we we should do something just through our newspaper, the Arizona Daily Star, to get this out there. And because I was thinking digitally, I was like, hey, maybe it could be a podcast. I didn't have a name attached to anything or anything like that. And at that same time, there was a move by Lee at the time to really push podcasts, both locally, and they were looking for national topics. And they figured, hey, like, we don't really have anybody who covers cannabis at a national level and doesn't really ask these national questions. Hey, you there in Tucson, you guys have a local guy. Is that something that maybe he'd be interested in?
Okay.
And so over the course of about 2 or 3 months, there was I pitched some ideas just as far as like sort of guests I would want, the sort of topics I would want to cover. And we ended up working out, should we do it bi-weekly, weekly? At first it was a bi-weekly idea. And then it eventually was like, hey, I've got a ton of people wanting to talk to me. Let's just do it weekly. But the idea for the name ended up coming about like 2 or 3 weekends before it was like ready to go live. I was still kind of like, what do I want to do here? And I was watching The Dark Knight Rises, and there's that moment where the Joker says, "Here we go," and I was like, "Oh, wait a minute! Like that would be a good little pun." It kind of embodies like what the industry is doing, like it's really taking off. I think it also kind of spoke to the ethos of like, hey, man, like this is kind of an experiment here for a legacy newspaper to be doing something in the cannabis space. So here we'd go. It maybe not the most creative pun in the industry, but it has worked and people remember it. So
If for nothing else, this industry is just great with the puns.
it is. It is. It's like Thai restaurants. Thai restaurants always have great puns, like tied up, or like the tricycle, where they're instead of a tricycle, sort of like there's some great ones.
Oh my goodness! I at a restaurant, the tricycle.
Yeah.
The tricycle with 5 stars. I don't know. That sounds like a dicey evening for me.
Right? Like yeah, like
So you've been doing the podcast for a while. What are the episodes that stand out to you where not only did the guest kind of shock you, but you thought that you kind of really it had something to put out there in the industry and your community and make a little bit of change?
I've got a few of them. The first one was she is a dispensary operator here in Arizona for the Giving Tree dispensaries, Lilach Mazor. On top of being the CEO and president, she also has started a few of her own brands. And one of those brands was these THC pills that were designed and marketed to women to help with menopause symptoms. And that was just, to me, it just blew my mind because I have just always thought of cannabis as like, hey, something to relieve my day from all the stress or to start my day, to get rid of the potential for any stress. And it was the first time I ever thought like, wow, like this really can be marketed to people in a health and wellness sort of way, as well as medicine. It's always been medicine. It's always had a medicinal quality. But for me, I'd always kind of associated that with like terminal cases or pain, and not so much with like women's issues. And this was like, oh wow, like that. This is a whole new world of products that I had no idea even existed, and this is like for 50% of the population. So maybe
True.
I need to start looking into the industry in a little bit different way. So that really changed my like perspective of what cannabis could do and could be. And then I also spoke with Flair.
Huh.
And getting the interview was like a month-long process. Like at first he was going to be down in Tucson, then he wasn't. Then it was going to be a Zoom interview. Then it was like, why don't we do it in person? I can come up to Phoenix to meet him. Then it had to be like, what time, where in Phoenix? But we finally met in his hotel room. at the Clarendon Hotel in Phoenix, which is a cannabis-friendly hotel. So he came in with his wife and I guess daughter, who were about the same age. But they were just having a great time with their whole entourage. And it was just kind of like me sitting in the corner, like, hey, when you guys are set up, Rick, I'd love to talk with you for 15, 20. And it was just really cool to kind of see the legend and see him. He had like a button down shirt that was like 3 buttons down. So he's still got the chest hair and everything. And he gave me a few woos during the interview.
I was gonna say, was the interview like a bunch of woos and his like kind of go-to catchphrases, or did he actually talk about his brand?
A little bit of the showman, of course, but we talked a lot about his brand, but a lot about just kind of like how he came to cannabis. I was thinking like, oh, maybe he had smoked it throughout his career, but that was really not the case. He had been on, opioids and painkillers for the longest time. And it wasn't until I think it was the late 2000s that he was really introduced to cannabis. And now he is a huge proponent and warrior, if you will, the ultimate warrior for cannabis as an alternative to those sort of pain medicines. And just hearing his journey was very cool, which is it's always cool, especially with folks who you would think like, hey, like this is something that I would think that you're into your whole life, and they surprise you and they're like, we always thought of it as like, it's fine to booze and do pills, but like cannabis, they test for that sort of thing. And to hear about his like kind of recovery and just being able to get his life back, as he put it, was really, really heartening and really cool to hear.
That's one thing about this industry that continues to blow my mind. The different phases of individuals' lives when they come to cannabis. So you say you started dabbling when you were like 14, 15. Have you always had a relationship with cannabis since then?
Like that 14, 15, it was really like sporadic. And not until I would say in my like mid 20s, or, maybe early to mid 20s, did I really start partaking in it on a daily or near daily basis. It had always been something that had been like associated with like parties and good times and hanging out for me. And then I went through a period in my 20s where like I wouldn't call it a depressive episode because I was never diagnosed with that, but I had what they would, I guess, in the 1800s call melancholia, where I just didn't know what I wanted to do. Figured I should have been in and had graduated school, and I had done neither of those things by that time. And cannabis to me, like, kind of relieved those like that nagging little questions, like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And kind of helped me through that. And I think helped me make me a little bit more positive of a person in a situation that I didn't want to be in at the time. But it helped me persevere and keep going. And it's something that I would never call it like, oh, my medicine that helped me through, like, like the stories we've been just recounting. But it definitely is something that I rely on and think of as a kind of a mood booster.
Is there anyone else in your life that uses it either for therapeutic use or as a mood booster?
It's funny because up until I really got into this industry and legalization in this state, both of my parents were very like, like you shouldn't really be using, you shouldn't really do this. And now they are both not daily users, but partake, whether it be in edibles or using it as balms for their aches and pains. They go to dispensaries at least once a month, both of them. Or they have me go to the dispensary for them, sometimes in my mom's case. And the rest of my family is the same way. My siblings, who used to blame me for every time they would get caught growing up with a bag in their, clothes or in their pockets. They well, they don't not partake every day. They still participate with it here and there, and it's kind of funny. The whole family used to really be like, hey, we need to keep this under wraps. And now it's much more openly used at family events as well. So
That was a real turning point for myself as well. The people that are coming to you, especially once they know that you're involved with the industry, with really pointed questions about what to experiment with and how they could potentially use it. And it's like, okay, I'm not a bud tender. This is what works for me. Go talk to somebody and they'll help you.
I got a ton of people reaching out to me, and they all did it through their non-work emails or non-work channels. Plenty of people within my newsroom that were like, so Eddie, what kind of edibles would you suggest if I'm having problems sleeping at night? And then I'd be like, this has worked for me. I've done some interviews where people talk about the, entourage effect and everything. You can listen to those. But talk with your bud tender when you walk in. They're usually a wealth of knowledge for the products and the sort of things on the shelves there at any dispensary you'll be visiting. So it has been cool to see folks reach out.
Well, one thing with the podcast is you wind up interviewing all types. And a lot of times, you get a guest and they're pitching their product or their process or how it's made. And have you ever found yourself in the middle of an interview where you're like, you know what, I just don't think this is going to work?
3 or 4 times that has happened. Where it's just been like, maybe we could use a section of this 2 or 3 minutes as like an intro to a larger episode on a topic. But there have been, it's very rare. I'd say it's 1 in every 15 or 20 interviews, where it's just like, this is just so in the weeds. A lot of times it's with really, I would say like the very scientific minded sort of guests who they talk a lot and it's not really for the layman. And oftentimes it's not even for people who are not in a specialty of the field.
Yeah.
And you kind of lose control of an interview and you're like, all right, I need to bring this back. I need to wrap this up and, thank them for their time and see what I could do to salvage at least some of this for the podcast.
So you've been covering cannabis in Arizona for the better part of 2 years, if not 2+. How would you describe the state of the cannabis industry in Arizona right now?
I would say that it is positively fragile. Right now, you see it's not a month over month growth, but there is a trend towards growth in sales and tax revenues collected from the recreational side of the program. That has grown steadily. It dropped off a little bit after the kind of artificial high that was 2021 when everything kind of came online and we were still in that pandemic mode. But it's gotten those numbers have now crept back up and exceeded it. However, on the medical program side of things have cratered. Things have really from what was about 450,000 folks on the medical rolls at the time right before legalization has now dropped to about 150, maybe just a little bit less. I didn't check out last month's numbers. And the sales have cratered. They're a fourth, somewhere between a fourth and a third of what they were before legalization. And for those first few months, they kind of maintained, but it has been a precipitous fall off the last 2 years, month by month, pretty much for the medical industry here. And what that means is you're seeing a lot more folks who are going in Recreationally, you can't buy as much cannabis to be it's what is it, a not a pound and a half, a ounce and a half limit for recreational sales, and it's 2.5, I believe, for medical sales. Plus, you could do more with concentrates and edibles as well. So you're not seeing those big, huge buyers as much. The whales are not coming in as much, but really those daily or commonly common customers who come in just looking for like an eighth or maybe an ounce in it to last them 2 weeks, sort of thing.
So are those medical users just transitioning to rec sales?
That's really the theory right now, that they're doing that. There's also there's also some evidence to suggest we have home grow here in Arizona. Not every state allows for that, but here in Arizona we do. And there's some thought that some folks have gone to that. And there is also a small, it's not as big as it is in some states like Oklahoma or California, but there is a small and but thriving black market within Arizona as well. And there's some evidence that folks may have transitioned to that as well. But a majority of them probably were just like, hey, most of the products now are geared towards recreational customers. Some of the licensed dispensaries now, even if they started as a medical dispensary, they've decided we're just going to go to all recreational sales, and they just don't even honor the medical program anymore. And that's supposed to be when you have a medical card, that allows you for more purchase as well, but it also exempts you from the state's 16% excise tax. So
that's what I thought. I figured that the tax would be enough of a bump to get people to stay in that program, but I guess maybe it just comes down to convenience.
Yeah, it's just a convenience factor, and like I said, I've heard of more than a few dispensaries that have just kind of gone away from their medical programs. They just have so many recreational customers that's who they're going to cater to.
Okay. Have you ever tried to grow at home?
I have not. People in my family have. I will keep the members of the family secret. But people in my family have, and it's been a mixed bag. The first time this person ever grew it, some of the best cannabis I've ever smoked. And since then, it's kind of been diminishing returns. But it is definitely, I would say it's worth it. I didn't have to grow it, but I would say that the person who grew it would say it was worth it, because it produced about 2 ounces of cannabis, and that lasted for that person a good 3 months. So
no, it's I feel like it's been a real mixed bag with people in my circle that have grown, between the people that have the patience to fine tune it, and when it works, it really works in terms of high yield. And then there's the other half where just have that brown thumb, and it's just not going to work no matter how hard they try.
I know if I tried, I would kill that plant within 4 to 5 weeks. I would water it too. I just don't know, man. There's so many variables, and I've always been good with words, numbers, and science. Like, I could tell you about it, but I can't do it,
Yeah.
So
yeah, we continue to kill a lot of succulents in our home. And when we have plants that need like almost zero maintenance, it's just not for us. Just not for us.
Totally get it.
So, I want to talk a little bit about the black market too. So has that seen a resurgence ever since legalization? And is that as a result of pricing?
I don't know if I'd call it a resurgence. I would say it kind of never went away.
Okay.
It's definitely not at the same scale, like I said, as like the Californias, and we haven't seen the influx of stuff coming over from California as bad as you see in Nevada either. But it is strong. I still hear from folks who are kind of ostensibly part of that gray zone in the industry here, who are like, hey, like some of the best growers I know are still in that underground space. And because law enforcement now has kind of like taken their foot off of the kind of enforcement of these sort of things, they're able to, as I mean, obviously the grows are not as big as you see at the licensed dispensaries, but they're able to operate grows in clandestine areas that are large enough that they're able to make a very good amount of money. I don't know what that translates to as far as like what they're taking percentage wise away from the industry. But I will say that one out of every 10 or 8 people that I interact with at like these vendor fairs that I go to will tell me they still get the majority of their product from somebody in the underground.
So what can Arizona do to kind of shore up this fragility?
Whew. So they're looking at a couple of things from that medical side of the program. There was a bill. I don't think it went anywhere that they were proposing. Then that the Arizona Dispensary Association got behind, that would have made it so that once you got your medical card, you would have only had to re-up it once every 5 years if you were a non-veteran, and if you were a veteran, you would have just paid for it once and never had to pay for it again. Currently, you have to re-up every 2 years. There's also a 1 year option, which is a little cheap. It's more expensive over 2 years, but if you just wanted 1 year, you could do it that way too. They would have got rid of that. And the other thing that I think the industry would need to do is really look at this excise tax. It would have to be something that would again be changed by this, by state. And because of the way that the law was passed, it was a citizens initiative. You need a super majority of the legislature to make any changes to the language within the law now. So you'd need a super majority, but there is some movement. Democrats are always 75% pretty receptive to any changes, but there's been some movement, and some Republicans at the state level here who are open to making, if not huge changes, some changes to the bill. The other thing that the state could do is, we are a limited license state. So you'll probably never see more than about 200 licenses issued within the state here, and those licenses are vertically integrated. So you get a retail spot, you get everything with those. And for a state that's growing so much that, I mean, I think our state population is comparable with that of Washington. Washington has more than 1,000 dispensaries. And you see the pricing there. Well, it's not ideal. It is much lower than it is here for item price. And I think those two changes would be big. Doing something about the excise tax, maybe bringing it down to a 10 or 12% rate, and allowing for, if not unfettered licensing, a little bit more, a little looser on the licensing end of things.
Is any of that black market product making it into the legit market?
I haven't heard anything about that yet. There has been a lot of recalls, however, within the state. And once those are, a lot of those, when they're investigated, they find that, oh, hey, this is cannabis that, number one, shouldn't have even been taken to a lab to be tested. It should have been, with internal controls within a company should have like caught this, and they should have remediated or destroyed it. Or number two, that there's a particular lab, which name escapes me, out of northern Arizona, that seems to be where folks are going if they want a higher THC score on their
Mm.
cannabis, or it's kind of borderline in parts per million if it's got some heavy metals or something like that in it. That it okay, well, this tested for that, but your other the other test sample that we have from that same batch didn't, so you could go ahead and sell it. So there has been a little bit of, I don't know if we want to call it skullduggery or just laziness on
Mm.
the part of some testing and testing regimes within the state. I'm actually having an investigator for another state come on and talk about how Arizona has had a lot of recalls this summer. And so there's been a little bit of that. I have not heard yet about black market or unregulated weed making it into a dispensary space.
The lab shopping I find particularly frustrating just because as an industry that is pushing so hard towards legitimacy, like that is going to be the number one issue is testing and truth in testing. And you just got to get it right. I understand that it's a short-term play. Over the long term, these testing facilities kind of will be flushed out. But in the interim, it's kind of a black eye.
It's a total black eye, and it's something that the sort of, I guess they're prohibitionists now. I don't know what you call the anti-cannabis crowd, but they're out there and they get vocal about it. And they talk about how these sort of testing look at they're not testing correctly for potency, and this cannabis is so potent now that if kids get a hold of it, they could get into a psychosis. And you hear a lot of this rhetoric now.
Mm-hmm.
And while I don't agree with it, if if a lab is being less than above board with some of its testing protocols, it's hard to argue that that this is a safe product or as safe as it could be. And the last thing you want is the watchdogs or the watchers to be the ones who are actually in on some of these schemes. So you hope they get fettered out and hope that the industry starts to right itself before, you don't want the FDA coming in. That'd be the worst thing,
True. Well, do you think it's more of it's not an if so much as it is a when the FDA is coming in, right? I mean, in the event that we ever attain a federal legalization?
I guess I talk with people who think that like maybe Schedule 3 is okay because the FDA won't be as incentivized to get down into the state level. Like, hey, this is what Minnesota does, and that's we find that better and better state practices. So you should do that over here in Montana, sort of thing. But I do think it's inevitable. At some point, the FDA is going to come in and be like, hey guys, the party is over. Your states, they've done the best they can, but we're going to take it from here. So I don't know if that's sooner rather than later, but it's an eventuality that will happen.
Well, as you mentioned, the state has seen a number of recalls recently. In your opinion, is that ADHS stepping up efforts, possibly being more overzealous, or is that operators who are stopping short?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that ADHS, when you really look at its mission and what it does primarily away from cannabis, there's no real reason for the Department of Health Service. I'm a believer that states should have their kind of own board of cannabis controls.
Agreed.
If there's some movement, there was some proposal, I think it wasn't this session, but last session, to kind of carve something akin to that out of ADHS. And I would support something like that. That'd be fine for me. A lot of these guys who ADHS have as like going out and looking, they're also going out and looking at restaurants, and this is just such a totally different thing. I guess maybe maybe it's a little bit closer to like what the state does for liquor licenses or liquor licensing. But even that is not really a one-to-one comparison. And at the same time, though, to this issue of recalls, there are some operators who they're willing to push everything right to the line. And maybe now with 1080E, folks being removed from that and the marginal tax rate not being between 65 and 75% for some of these companies, maybe they won't be as incentivized to push that line as far. But there are definitely still licensed operators here who they're about that dollar, baby, and they're willing to do a lot to make it. So,
well, and it's incredibly competitive. You got to do everything you can.
You've only got 200 operators,
Yeah.
So if there's some belief in me that like more operators would make this less, of an issue. But there's that other, side of the coin where it's like now you might open it to more bad actors. But I it's that competition, man. It really is.
So I recently had another conversation about what is it going to take to get these underground growers or legacy operators that are kind of the legacy brain trust and pull them into the legitimate market. And, one person just flat said, you got to pay to get them on in more sort of like into the C-suite and management roles. Do you see that happening, or do you have any other ideas as to how to pull sort of that tribal knowledge out of the legacy market and into the legitimate market?
So one person who she kind of has 1 foot in the legacy market and 1 foot, she is a grower also for a licensed dispensary as well. So she's kind of opening herself up to a lot of scrutiny there. But for her big issue was like, I want to actually have some ownership. It's great to be, a head grower or one of the head growers at whatever company here in Arizona. But, the pay is okay. It's not what I feel I should be making. And if I had a field of my own, which she does, I can make more that way. What she ended up doing was she ended up going to New Mexico with where her partner lives, and they got a license there because the license process is not nearly as onerous as it is here in Arizona. It's not a lottery, so it's not just a luck of the draw, and the barrier for entry financially is not as high. So part of me thinks offering these folks a legitimate chance to like, hey, like, we're not going to really look too much into your social equity background. If you've got it, that's great too. We've got that sort of program. But you say you've got some experience on the growing end and the legacy end of things. Let's, maybe that could apply to the retail side of things too. So I think giving these folks an option to like, hey, come on in, give it a chance. Let the free market decide. Maybe, you're the best at growing this sort of stuff. I think having options like that would be big for these sort of folks who, again, sometimes have charges on their record that would scare, if not legacy corporations and some MSOs away.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting, though, that I guess I don't know how you necessarily prove your legacy credentials, but, you kind of come in and say, hey, listen, I know what I'm doing. And if there is some sort of method of being able to sort of turn over a new leaf, I think that's interesting. See, it's all puns. It's all puns.
It is. All of them. They just smoke their way in, so.
But I like that idea of, maybe stepping outside of the lottery system and licensing people based on their history of work, let's say.
Yeah, I think that, with folks who they've been doing it, it's not necessarily something you can put on a resume that like, hey, Philip Morris. I was a grower serendipitously up in the iron, the Green Triangle of California for years. But there has to be a way for folks to like be able to be recognized, like, hey, like I have put in the time and effort within this community. Um, you know, talk to people that know me.
Yeah.
I can do this.
Some sort of referral based plus what their record says.
And for this person whose story I'm recounting for you, I can't wait to see what her dispensary looks like over in New Mexico. And I believe they'll be opening in December or January of next year. So yeah, that'll be cool to see.
Another cultural event that you've covered recently is the Stoned Cafe and Event Center. And I really like the idea, this opportunity for cannabis friendly venues. Is this the only venue in Arizona, or is there been sort of a groundswell of cannabis friendly venues?
So there are 2 in Tucson, and I believe 5 or 6 up in the Phoenix area. And while these are cannabis cafes or consumption lounges ostensibly, they differ a little bit from what you see in a Nevada or California, where those are licensed through either the state or locally, depending on what their license structure is. In Arizona, these are private clubs. So it's essentially like a bar with a cover charge. And you can pay, like, if you're just going in for the day for like an event, you can pay that event's cover charge to go in. Or if you're a member at one of these places and they have, a $25, $50 membership, a yearly membership or a monthly membership that you can pay, you usually get into those sort of events for free or for a discounted rate. And these events are usually huge. And these event spaces, even when they're not holding events, you usually have a ton of people just meeting there, playing board games, drinking cannabis cocktails that they might have that they're making there. There's no selling or trading of weed, but there can be free giveaways, or donations made. But you won't. It's they're even the one that is tied to the dispensary. You can't do any sort of sale there or anything like that. You have to go into the dispensary and actually buy the weed. So that's how those in Arizona differ from what you're going to see in Nevada and California. I think Michigan has them too. But they are great meeting spaces. Some of my best friends, both inside and outside of the industry, that's where I hang out with them at. And I really compare it to like a bar, but it's just based around the consumption of cannabis.
Interesting. What's the vibe like compared to a bar?
A little smokier. A little bit more 1980s when it comes to like the actual like visual
haze
and the haze and everything. Yeah. But really similar. People just kind of within their own little like cliques or groups. There is at both of these locations a physical bar that you can belly up to, and you can, if you brought your own, you can make your own little cannabis cocktails. They've got CBD stuff that they sell as well. I would say that they're a little bit more chill than your local bar. You're not going to get as many fist fights, that's for sure. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody fighting at any of these. There's a lot more comfortable cushioned seating than you see at most bars.
Fair. That's fair. Well, Eddie, thank you very much for taking the time with us today. I really do appreciate it. I want to make sure, before we get out of here, is there anything else in particular that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience knows either about yourself, your podcast, or your work with the Daily Star?
Just keep looking for my podcast, really anywhere you can stream your podcast. It's Here Weed Go. You can look for all my stories at TucsonMarijuanaGuide.com. That's part of the Arizona Daily Star's suite of, websites. And then, you can also subscribe there to my bi-weekly newsletter, which is the Here Weed Go newsletter. So feel free to look for all of that. Like, follow, and subscribe here.weed.go on Instagram. And that Instagram will link you to my personal Instagram, where I've got all my travel and foodie adventures up as well. So I'm always out there, even if I'm not high, getting some food in me and traveling. So
when is the interview with this investigator that you were talking about?
That should be next week. And we'll be letting that out by, I believe, the middle of October.
Okay.
That should be airing then. So
okay. Definitely.
Your episode's coming out next week, man.
Oh, very good. Hey, I love the opportunity to be on your podcast, and I really like it, when a couple of podcasts can come together and everybody can kind of share their story.
Exactly. Is this a crossover episode? Like, yeah, I like it.
You got to find all the hidden Easter eggs throughout it. Well, Eddie, thanks again, man. I really appreciate it, and I hope we get a chance to do it again soon.
David, thank you so much. I hope to meet up with you sooner than later.
Oh, absolutely. Before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by giving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You could also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. All right, for Eddie Celaya, host of the Here Weed Go podcast and reporter at the Arizona Daily Star, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.